Hello, class. We're on to Act 4 of Macbeth. Again, I'm using the Norton Critical Edition, second edition. Here, we ended Act 3 with a discussion between Lennox and a lord, and so we were getting kind of upper class perspective on the situation and a bit of shifting away from support for Macbeth, right? And so we get into Act 4, and we're back to the witches, and to Hecate as well, who is the kind of like, I don't know, queen of the witches is a way, I guess, to think of her. And again, this kind of this enchanted language, right? That's done in rhyming couplets, um, so famous. And it's not just that it's famous in Macbeth. It's just, I think that Shakespeare in a lot of ways sets up the cultural precedent for the ways that we see this happening in other cultures. But if you think about like Snow White and fairy tales, like that kind of language, like mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all, right? That's really being drawn from kind of folk culture, but that enchanted language is magic, right? It's spell work, and that's something that Shakespeare has really latched onto, and it's a very old part of the English language. And so the shifts in the way that the language flows tells us a lot about characters, so that you've got to have kind of a little bit of a musical ear, I think, to be hearing some of this stuff. So I read a lot out loud in these reading videos here. And we get this repeated, we'll always look for threes, and these collective moments: double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Um, I'm going to skip down to the third witch here. Scale of dragon, tooth of wolf, witch's mummy, maw and gulf, of the ravened salt-sea shark, root of the hemlock digged in the dark, liver of blaspheming Jew, gall of goat and slips of yew, silvered in the moon's eclipse, nose of Turk and Tartar's lips, finger of birth strangled babe, ditch delivered by drab, make the gruel thick and slab. I'll just keep finished. Add thereto a tiger's chaudron for the ingredients of our cauldron. And so all of these nasty things are being put in, but we see the inherent cultural racism, right, that's going on against the so-called blaspheming Jew. The liver of the Jew is being put in, and this is all like a black mass, right, like a witch's kind of mass that's going on here. But these are the things that they deal with. We see that Shakespeare's culture is setting up these evil things, the nose of a Turk, right, a Muslim Turk, right? So we see that kind of Euro-Christian centered culture in the backdrop of the play, definitely here um, as well. And so that's just one of those moments, even though the play is set in pre-Christian times, you have to sort of understand it from the Euro-Christian perspective, like temporal perspective that's surrounding Shakespeare. And we shouldn't, try to just pass over these moments of where there's this inherent kind of racism in texts. It shows us very much that this was part of the culture at the time, and there's no reason to gloss over it or sort of deny it. I think that we need to sort of confront to what extent that is there. And then if we're having that broader question that I've asked, is this a pagan play, is it a Christian play, are there moments of critique, are there moments of dissent that the play unravels itself, even if individual characters are saying racist things? Should we attribute that to the characters? Should we attribute it to Shakespeare? These are all philosophical and reading questions that are that we need to attend to as we become better readers of texts. So Macbeth breaks in on the witches and says, and notice, so they've been having this incantatory language, and when he breaks in, he talks really different. He sounds like he's speaking in this 10 syllable line, blank verse, so it's not rhymed at the end. but it is still in verse, unlike the prose of the earlier Porter character, if you remember from an earlier lecture. So I'm at line 49 here in Act 4.1. Macbeth says, I conjure you by that which you profess, however you come to know it, answer me. Though you untie the winds and let them fight against the churches, though the yeasty waves confound and swallow navigation up, though bladed corn be lodged and trees blown down, though castles topple on their warders' heads, though palaces and pyramids do slope their heads to their foundations, though the treasure of nature's garments tumble all together, even till destruction sicken, answer me to what I ask you. So he's got this first sentence that's 2 lines long, and then the rest of that stanza is just all one long sentence that just kind of builds up in this feverish pitch, right? So we see emotion being conveyed in the linguistic structure of the sentencing there, and the way that the sentences sort of build towards him saying, like, I demand that you, like, this is what I ask you, I want you to tell me this stuff, rather than that kind of swaying back kind of couplets, rhyming couplets that the witches have. And then the witches, like, in sequence, speak, demand, will answer. Um, Say if thou'dst rather hear it from our mouths or from our masters, right? So they're like, ooh, like who are we gonna really go for? And Macbeth is just right there with it. Call him, let's call him on. Let's call on all the dark forces, right? And so he's just no fear when it comes to that kind of stuff, right? And so the witches here go, pour in sow's blood that hath eaten her 9 farrow grease that's sweeten or sweaten. And so that sweaten or sweeten and eaten, like, we know that, like, today in English we don't hear these as necessarily rhymes, but it tells us that to the ears of English people in Shakespeare's time, that the sound of aten and eaten and sweeten, that it was blurred enough that that would have sounded like a rhyme. So we get some linguistic history in the text as well. And so then we get these apparitions, right? And then we get 3 apparitions. I mean, you can think of it like Charles Dickens and Uncle Scrooge and A Christmas Carol, like the 3 apparitions. All of these kinds of threes show up throughout English literature and culture when it's associated with folk magic, with witches, the supernatural. And the first apparition warns to beware of Macduff. The second apparition, of course, says, be bloody, bold, and resolute, laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. Right? And so Macbeth is like, yes, okay, I'm going to take this on. Nothing can hurt me. And he doesn't even think Macduff can hurt him then after that, right? And so he's getting kind of built up. And then the third apparition, which is a child, actually, interesting. Be lion, mettled, proud, and take no care, who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are. Macbeth shall never vanquished be, until great Birnam wood to high Dunsinane hill shall come against him. And so he's like, of course, Macbeth is like, well, that's not going to happen. That's like physically impossible. The wood is over there. So he takes this as all of these as good signs. And then the witches say, seek to know no more, right? And Macbeth immediately transgresses. I will be satisfied. Deny me this, and an eternal curse fall upon me. Let me know. And then they show this vision of the 8 kings with Banquo at the end. And of course, that's signifying, if you think about Shakespeare's audience, that's signifying the lineage that comes down to King James the First of England, who's King James the Sixth of Scotland, same guy, right? And so we see a direct reference of this when Macbeth is describing what he sees. He says, and yet the 8th appears, who bears a glass which shows me many more, and some I see that twofold balls and treble scepters carry. And the twofold balls and treble scepters is signaling the fact that King James the First is both King of England and Scotland at the same time. It's not the United Kingdom yet. That's a later political idea that comes about a century later. than this, and but we see that King James the First has united those two realms. Of course, they'll bring in Ireland later on as well. And then the witches kind of disperse and disappear, and Macbeth sees Lennox, and Lennox uh, says, he's like, "Where did they go? Where did they go?" Um, uh, and Lennox informs Macbeth that Macduff has fled to England, and we know that that's where Malcolm is, right? And Malcolm is eventually gets joined by Donald Bane. So these are the sons of Macduff, or sorry, of Duncan, who King Duncan, who has been murdered, of course. Um, and interestingly, here, like right after this scene of like Banquo and his lineage, Macbeth decides he's going to go after Macduff's family and his children. It's a really nasty move, and he's becoming this like this killer of babies, right? He says, up around line 148, the castle of Macduff I will surprise, seize upon Fife, give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and all unfortunate souls that trace him in his line. But it's like Macduff was never really set up as being a threat in terms of his lineage, but he's like, it's like Macbeth is taking out his vengeance on that he wants to take out on Banquo, and projecting it onto Macduff and his family. And then we get 4.2. We get a shift over down to England, right? Or sorry, not to England yet. We're at Macduff's house, and this is where we get this exchange with a wife and a son, and Ross, who's come to warn them that Macbeth is going to send somebody, but it's too late, right? And this exchange is quite interesting and beautiful between the son and the wife, because the son shows this kind of childlike, really perceptive wisdom. I'm popping up to line around. Um, uh, uh, well, like, let me go to about 46, where the child asks, like, "What's a traitor?" And the wife says, "Why, one that swears and lies. And be all traitors that do so? Everyone that does so is a traitor and must be hanged." And must they all be hanged that swear and lie? Everyone. Uh, who must hang them? Why, the honest men. Then liars and swearers are fools, for there are liars and swearers enough to beat the honest men and hang up them. And his mom is like, "Now God help thee, poor monkey, but how wilt thou do for a father?" Um, and there's this like real perception that, and it's this perception of raw power, right? Like there aren't enough honest people in the world to stand up to all of the liars and traitors of the world. Um, and then the messenger warns them to fly, and then and it's just too late. The murderers come, and they kill the boy, and they run after him. But they kill the boy on stage. So this is just something just to notice about the gruesomeness of Macbeth as a play, is that he's willing to show on stage these kind of like dark witches ceremonies, the murder of a child on the screen, or on the stage. So now we get to England in 4.3, and Malcolm and Macduff are sort of going back and forth, and Malcolm has this kind of like, I mean, he's young too, right? He's a young man, and he starts talking about how kind of unworthy he is to be king, because of all of these aspirations to power that he will have in himself too. So there's that kind of temptation to power, that flirtation with that, this seduction of power that we've seen with Duncan, or sorry, not with Duncan, but with Macbeth and with Banquo, throughout the play. And Macduff is trying to say, like, I mean, you should take over as king. We should go take back Scotland. And Malcolm's kind of like, I don't know if I'm the right person for the job. And he says, around lines 58 here, He says, I grant to Macbeth that he's bloody, luxurious, avaricious, false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking in every sin that has a name. But there's no bottom, none, to my voluptuousness. Your wives and your children, your matrons and your maids could not fill up the cistern of my lust and my desire. All continent impediments would overbear that did oppose my will. Better Macbeth than such an one to reign. It's like, yeah, Macbeth's awful, but like, I have these really nasty thoughts myself, and none of your wives and daughters would be safe if I became king. And he's just trying to be honest about it, and you don't know if he's quite being cowardly or if he's being just like honest about like the evil that exists in him. So there's this kind of introspective look going on. And it turns into this kind of philosophical discourse on tyranny, like what makes a tyrant. Um, Macduff says, boundless impertinence in nature is a tyranny. It hath been the untimely emptying of the happy throne and fall of many kings, but fear not yet to take upon what's yours. You may convey your pleasures in a spacious plenty, and yet seem cold, and the time you may so hoodwink. Um, we have willing dames enough. There's enough women who will want to sleep with you when you're king. There cannot be that vulture in you to devour so many as will to greatness dedicate themselves, finding it so inclined. And so he's like trying to egg Malcolm on here. And of course, this discussion is happening about kings while, there's a king in the audience, King James. And we know there's so much about this play that is directed at king. And this philosophical discussion about kingship is the way that Shakespeare can sort of couch advice and thoughts about the nature of power in a safe way. But it is definitely commenting on politics of the time, right? And who is he? He's just this playwright who's able to do this. So I'm skipping over to line 114. Malcolm has been convinced by Macduff, and he says, Macduff, this noble passion, child of integrity, hath from my soul wiped the black scruples, reconciled my thoughts to thy good truth and honor. Devilish Macbeth, by what many of these trains hath sought to win me into his power, and modest wisdom plucks me from over credulous haste. But God above deal between thee and me, for even now I put myself to thy direction, and excuse me, I've lost my place, and unspeak mine own detraction. Here abjure the taints and blames I laid upon myself for strangers to my nature. I am yet unknown to woman. So he's like, I'm a virgin. And he's like, oh, you're like a young guy, and like you've had lots of thoughts about women, and so you feel like you have this unbounded lust, but it's not really based in actual experience, right? Unknown to woman, never was forsworn, scarcely have coveted what was mine own. At no time broke my faith, would not betray the devil to his fellow and delight. And so, like, Macduff has given him a picture of Duncan, his father, and what a good king his father was, and queen his mother was, and that's what ends up kind of swaying Malcolm in this moment. And then they get word of basically what has happened. To Macduff's children here. Malcolm, at one point, this is line around 188, 87. But their comfort we are coming thither. Gracious England hath lent us a good sword and 10,000 men, an older and better soldier, none that Christendom gives out. And so there's that kind of Christian language sort of showing up again, that mixture of times showing up. And Christendom also being associated with England, right? That England is like a stall, a harbinger of Christian faith, perhaps against a more pagan type of Scotland at the time. And so the There's some language about gender showing up again here towards the end. Um, Malcolm is saying, let your grief about your family who's been destroyed, Malcolm, be turned to anger. Blunt not the heart, but enrage it. Macduff says, oh, I could play the woman with mine eyes, and braggart with my tongue, but gentle heavens, cut short all intermission. Front to front, bring thou this fiend of Scotland and myself within my sword's length, set him. If he escape, heaven forgive him too. And Malcolm says this tune goes manly, right? So there's this contrast between the manly and the womanly. This tune goes manly. Come, go we to the king, our power is ready. Our lack is nothing but our leave. Macbeth is ripe for shaking, and the powers above put on their instruments. Receive what cheer you may. The night is long that never finds the day. And so this impulse towards power as well, and that's going to take us to the end of Act 4. I'm just going to make a little pause here, and I'll make a combined video of Act 4 and Act 5, and then that will be the play. Okay, class, we're on to Act 5 for Macbeth, and so one of the things that you'll notice is of course there's a lot of action in Act 5, right? So there's been this kind of build up, and so there's fighting and battle scenes, and it's an interesting thing about Macbeth as a play is that it starts with a battle scene, it starts in war, and it ends basically in war. I mean, there's a little bit at the end where they're not at war, but it's framed in that sort of way, and so in some ways that's led people to think that that there might be, like, if you're going for like arguing that you think that it's more of a pagan play, that it's doing this kind of cyclical thing, and it's just a new cycle is starting over again. And yes, we have a new king, but Malcolm definitely, we know, is not necessarily completely innocent or void of unjust kinds of thoughts about what his power means. I mean, he was contemplating it before. And so different directors, for example, in the Roman Polanski film version of the text, the end kind of suggests that there's going to, a new cycle is going to start. Again, you can watch the film if you want to figure out how Polanski is doing it. So there's a lot that's left up to stage directors when we're talking about drama, right, for how they want to read a particular play. Act 5 opens with the doctor, and we find that Lady Macbeth has fallen into kind of some sort of a psychotic break, some kind of sickness or a mental illness. The doctor says around lines 7, a great perturbation in nature to receive at once the benefit of sleep and do the effects of watching. In this slumbery agitation, besides her walking and other actual performances, what at any other time have you heard her say? And so he's talking to the gentlewoman who's called the doctor, and the gentlewoman doesn't want to say what Lady Macbeth has said, because apparently she's revealed things that she shouldn't reveal. But there's this kind of sleepwalking. She's induced into this kind of trance-like state. She's not herself. And she's in this liminal place between wakefulness and sleep. And what we see is this kind of very interesting reversal of roles in some ways throughout the course of the text, where Lady Macbeth earlier on in the play is the one who seems to have all of her mind about her. She knows exactly what she wants. She eggs Macbeth on. And then we get that moment in the play where he calls her just his dearest Chuck, right? And he doesn't quite confide in her for all of his bloody deeds. And so we see these lovers kind of like drifting apart a little bit in their marriage, in their or at least in what they're sharing with each other in terms of their plans. And part of those deeds that seem to have affected Lady Macbeth is the slaying of Macduff's wife and child. That definitely shows up here. Um, a little bit further down in 5.1 here, the doctor says, "You see her eyes are open," and the gentlewoman says, "Aye, but their senses are shut." So this kind of reversal of sense itself, right? Um, what is it she does now, says the doctor. "Look how she rubs her hands." And the gentlewoman says, "It's an accustomed action with her to seem thus washing her hands. I've known her continue this in a quarter of an hour." So 15 minutes of this kind of obsessive compulsive running her hands over each other. Um, and so Lady Macbeth then says, "Yet here's a spot." And then the very famous lines from the play: "Out, damned spot, out, I say, 1, 2, why then 'tis time to do it. Hell is murky, fie, my lord, fie, a soldier in the fared. What need we fear? Who knows?" And she's kind of like going back and forth in these different mental states. "Who knows it when none can call our power to account? Yet who would have thought that the old man to have had so much blood in him?" And so she seems to be kind of letting out, that she and Macbeth are the culprits behind the assassination of Duncan here. She goes on, "The Thane of Fife had a wife," that's Macduff, right? "Where is she now? What will these hands never be clean? No more of that, my lord, no more of that. You mar all this with this starting." And so remember, of course, earlier in the play, she was like a little water gets out this spot or washes off the blood, and she can't now get some sort of imagination. So when we go from Macbeth having visions and seeming out of his mind to Macbeth being like full of action and ready to just go full on into everything, including to like call the witches to give him the darkest of dark, call on their dark masters for more information, and Lady Macbeth is now having these visions of blood that she can't keep out. Later on in the scene, she says, to bed, there's a knocking at the gate." So again, that knocking imagery shows up from earlier on in the play. "Come, come, 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 give me your hand. What's done cannot be undone. To bed, to bed, to bed." And the doctor says here at the end, "Foul whisperings are abroad. Unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles. Infected minds to their deaf pillows will discharge their secrets. More needs she the divine than a physician." So that's a kind of close reference to religion there. Like she needs to make things right with her God, than more than she needs a doctor. "God, God, forgive us all. Look after her. Remove from her the means of all annoyance, and still keep eyes upon her. So, good night. My mind she has mated, and amazed my sight. I think, but dare not speak." Then we get a shift over to the battlefield, and everybody's sort of preparing for battle. On one side, Angus and Lennox, and preparing for the arrival of the English forces. So these are the kind of the people who are staying with Macbeth on this side, and we get this language of obedience sort of being discussed here. Line 25, Caithness says, "Well, march we on to give obedience where 'tis truly owed. Meet we the medicine of the sickly wheel, and with him pour we in our country's purge, each drop of us." And Lennox says, "Or so much as it needs, to do the sovereign flower and drown the weeds. Make we our march towards Burnham." and yeah, so there's like questioning of loyalty and what needs to be done, and then we get Macbeth here, and in 5.3, bring me no more reports, he says, let them all fly, all till Burnham would remove to Dunsinane, I cannot taint with fear. What's the boy Malcolm? Was he not born of woman? The spirits that know all mortal consequences have pronounced me thus. Fear not, Macbeth. No man that's born of a woman shall ever have power upon thee. Then fly, false thanes, and mingle with the English epicures. And he's like, yeah, okay. So people are ditching out on me. He sees that this is happening. He's like, go ahead, but like, I'm gonna be okay. Uh, um, the mind I sway by, and heart I bear, shall never sag with doubt, nor shake with fear. And then a servant comes in and he says, "The devil damn thee black, thou cream-faced loon," like white-faced, somebody who's scared. Where gotst thou that goose look? And the servant's like, "There's 10,000 English troops out there," and Macbeth is just sort of like brushing him off aside here. And he calls in Seaton, his servant, and then he is talking to the doctor here. He's like informing him about Lady Macbeth, and Macbeth just doesn't have any kind of compassion for it, really. He just says, "Cure her of that. Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased? Pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart." And it's almost like he's asking as much for himself in some way as he's asking this impossible task of the doctor. And the doctor says, of course, that therein the patient must minister to himself. And Macbeth says, "Throw physic to the dogs, I'll none of it. Come, put mine armor on, give me my staff. Seaton, send out. Doctor, the thanes fly from me. People are betraying me," from the earlier scene. And "Come, sir, dispatch, if thou couldst, doctor, cast the water of my land, find her disease, and purge it to a sound and pristine health. I would applaud thee to the very echo that should applaud again. Pull it off, I say. What rhubarb, senna, or purgative drug would scour these English hence? Hearest thou of them?" "Aye, good my lord," says the doctor. "Your royal preparation makes us hear something. Bring it after me. I will not be afraid of death and bane till Burnham Forest come to Dunsinane again." "Were I from Dunsinane away and clear," says the doctor, "profit again should hardly draw me here." After Macbeth has left, right? He's like, "I'm out of here." He's not really going to find a cure for Lady Macbeth. And then we pop over to Malcolm's side here, and just basically preparing for battle. I'm kind of going to skip over 5.4. At the end here, the time approaches that will with due decision make us know what we shall say we have and what we owe. Thoughts speculative, their unsure hopes relate, but certain issues strokes must arbitrate, towards which advance the war. And so this war is sort of coming, and war is just like, it's like, there's a time to arbitrate, there's a time to like discuss things philosophically, but the war is coming, and it's bringing with it like the necessity of action, right? And that's of course been like this big theme around gender in the play. So we pop back over to Macbeth, and there's a cry of women within, and Macbeth has this little moment of self-reflection here around line 9 and 5.5. I've almost forgot the taste of fears. The time has been my senses would have cooled to hear such to hear a night shriek, and my fell of hair would at a dismal treatise rouse and stir. I would have gotten goosebumps, right? As life were in it. I've supped full with horrors, direness familiar to my slaughterous thoughts cannot once start me. He's like, I'm insensitive to the shrieks of these women. And he asks, like, where was the cry? And Seton tells them, the queen is dead. And we get some of the darkest lines in all of Shakespeare, and these are some of the most famous lines of the play, right here. She should have died hereafter, which is just like, what a weird thing. Your wife has just died, and like all he can say is like, she should have waited till after this when it would have been a better time to die. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And so we've seen him flirt with this kind of nihilistic type of attitude throughout the play. But here, the nihilism is kind of different. It's not just like, what does it matter anymore? Like, I've killed someone and now life doesn't matter. All's but toys. That kind of language was showing up earlier in the play. But here, it's like, it's a grander sort of cosmological look on like what life is really about, and life seems to be really about nothing. And yet, even the nothingness of life doesn't prevent him from proceeding on in his action towards this war here. And so again, the messenger comes in to say that it seems like the wood is moving, right? And Macbeth says, if thou speaks false, upon the next tree shall thou hang alive, till famine cling thee, if thy speech be soeth. I care not if thou dost for me as much. I put in resolution and begin to doubt the evocation of the fiend that lies like the truth. And he says again the quote, fear not till Burnham wood do come to Dunsinane, and now a wood comes toward Dunsinane, arm, and out. If this which he avouches does appear, there is nor flying hence nor tarrying here. I again to be wary of the sun, and wish the estate of the world were now undone. Ring the alarum bell, blow wind, come rack. At least we'll die with harness on our back. So he's just like, I'm resigned to my fate. This seems to be what's really happening, and I wasn't supposed to be afraid until Burnham Wood comes to Dunsinane. That seems to be happening, but there's no going back. There's that, like, remember that earlier, I've waded in blood up this far. It would be fruitless to turn back. And so there's this, like, by the end of this act, there's just this overarching theme of there is no return, no return. And that's a question that I've asked you in my earlier lectures and in discussion posts for us to think about, is at what point there, like, no more turning back in the play? Is it faded from the outset of the play? Is there a moment in the play where there would be this kind of moment for redemption? If so, at what point is that? And at what point does it shift, right? And if there's not, if it's just all about fate, then of course it's kind of this pagan play. And if there's these moments for redemption, then it speaks to some sort of Christian idea. So we get to 5.6 here. We're back to Malcolm and Seward and Macduff. And there's just charge. So we've like got this kind of shifting back and forth from perspectives, right? And then 5.7, we're back to Macbeth. Um, and they're surrounded. He knows that it's not looking good, and he says they've tied me to a stake. I cannot fly, but bear-like, I must fight the course. I'm just gonna go. I'm gonna go for it. What's he that was not born of woman? Should one am I to fear or none? And so he's still got this kind of sense that he's invincible, right? And of course we could read hubris into this, right? Of course that seems to be what's going on. He's already pressed his beyond the limits of what humanity is, and that's a classic theme in Aristotle as well. Uh, um, and he kills young Seward. So again, another instance of Macbeth slaying the youth, right? Um, uh, um, and Seward is young Seward is kind of a parallel in some ways, I would say, to Malcolm, who's the young Duncan in the play. Uh, and then Macduff comes in, and he's directly after Macbeth, right? He's got a vengeance for his wife and child that he wants to go for. And Macbeth says, he's got this moment of almost conscience again. He's like, I don't want to fight you. I've already taken too much blood from you. So like, let's. But Macduff is like, no, we're gonna go for it. I want to fight you. And then in that exchange, of course, we find out that Macduff says, um, despair thy charm, and let the angel whom thou hast served tell thee Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. So it appears that um, uh, he had some sort of early C-section, right? Like he was um, torn out of his mom's womb, and perhaps his mom died um, during childbirth because of it. And so Macbeth says, accursed be that tongue that tells me so, for it hath cowed my better part of man. Okay, so it's like there's some fear coming in here. And be these juggling fiends no more believed that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope, all night, not fight with thee. And then Macduff says, then yield thee, coward. And so like calls him, like challenges his manhood right there, right? Call thee, then yield thee, coward, and live to be the show and gaze of the time. We'll have thee as our rarer monsters are, painted upon a pole and underwrit. Here may you see the tyrant. And this, of course, checks Macbeth's momentary lapse, right? And he says, I will not yield to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, and to be baited with the rabble's curse. Though Burnham would be come to Dunsinane, and though opposed, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last. I'm just going to keep pushing. Before my body I throw my warlike shield, lay on Macduff, and damned be him that first cries hold enough. And they fight, and of course Macduff wins, and then we see him returning with Macbeth's body to Malcolm. Then they're being informed that young Seward has been slain, and Ross says, your son, my lord, has paid a soldier's debt. He only lived but till he was a man, the which no sooner had his prowess confirmed in the unshrinking station where he fought, but like a man he died. Then is he dead, Seward says, I am brought off the field, your cause of sorrow. And his dad seems to be concerned whether or not, like, he had wounds and all this stuff, and he seems to have died fighting in this valiant way. And so old Seward says, why then, God's soldier be he. Had I as many sons as I have hairs, I would not wish them to a fairer death. And so is his knell is knolled. He's worth more sorrow, says Malcolm, and that I'll spend for him. And Seward says, he's worth no more. They say he parted well and paid his score, and so God be with him. Here comes newer conflict. He's just over it. Like, this is his kind of acceptance of the death in battle. And then Macduff comes and brings Macbeth's head, right? So he's chopped off Macbeth's head. and this ends the battle scene, uh, and then we get Malcolm's kind of last words here. I'll read them out here because it's the end of the play. Um, we shall not spend a large, expensive time before we reckon with your several loves and make us even with you. So look how he's adopted the royal we language now that he's officially king here. My thanes and kinsmen henceforth be earls, the first that ever Scotland in such an honour named. What's more to do, which would have planted newly with the time, as calling home our exiled friends abroad, that fled the snares of watchful tyranny, producing forth the cruel ministers of this dead butcher and his fiend-like queen, who, as 'tis thought, by self and violent hands took off her life. Because this is basically, people think that, I mean, the speculation is that Lady Macbeth killed herself, right? That's how she died. Um, uh, this and what needful else that calls upon us by the grace of grace, we will perform in measure, time, and place. So thanks to all at once, and to each one whom we invite to see us crowned at Scone. And it's the end of the play. And so then the question is like, well, is that a redemptive moment? Do you think that order is restored by the transition to Malcolm as a king? Or is just this another sort of temporary kind of peace between an ongoing bloody battle, or Game of Thrones, to make that kind of a reference as well? I think that, I mean, so as I've told you throughout these kind of reading lectures, scholars themselves debate, but it's just a good way of thinking about the play itself, whether or not there's redemption or not. Certainly there's a lot of Christian stuff going on in the play, and certainly that's a different element than the classic tragedy that we had with Euripides' Bacchae. And that notion of fate and redemption, right? Like if redemption is that moment that might be able to change one's lot in life, for example. And does the play seem to be accepting of that, or is the play more adhering to this kind of maybe more ancient tragedy, or definitely more of a sort of a pagan way of thinking about the world itself? So there are other questions I ask you in discussion posts, but those are ones to especially think about. And I'll end these lectures here. You've got these that help you get through what happens in the play. And now in discussion posts, I want to hear what you think about the play. And then you can go ahead and watch the film version of Macbeth, and look at what you think. One of the questions I'll have you think about is whether or not you think that the director for the film version of Macbeth has chosen a particular way towards that question of redemption, of Christian versus pagan, in the way that the play has been portrayed on the film. Email me with questions or other thoughts. There's a lot more insight from stuff in the play that I didn't necessarily cover, so this is an intro lecture for sure, but at least we walked all the way through it, and hopefully that these lectures have helped you understand the language a little bit better, and help you think about what you want to say in your responses. I'm around for questions. Go ahead and take care, and carry on with your reading responses this week. Be looking for future videos on next week's topics as well.